My grandmother has been dead for 3 years. Her neighbors still cannot get rid of her. That is not a ghost story. That is a gardening story. And by the time I get to it, you are going to understand exactly why it is the most perfectly executed revenge I have ever heard in my life. But we are not starting there. Because before we get to the patient ones, the ones who played the long game, and one I need to tell you about the ones who didn't wait at all. There are people in this world who will never stop until you make stopping worth their while. You can talk to them. You can leave notes. You can knock on their door at midnight and explain very calmly that what they are doing is ruining your life. And they will nod, smile, close the door, and go right back to doing exactly what they were doing the moment you walk away. Words don't work on these people. Only consequences do. Every single person in these stories learned that. Some learned it gently. Some learned it the hard way. And a few of them well. You'll see. I had to be up at 2:30 every morning to make my 4 o'clock shift. Not 2:45. 2:30. That meant lights out by 9, sometimes 10 at the absolute latest. I wasn't asking for silence all night. I was asking for the bare minimum that any decent human being extends to another. My downstairs neighbors had a different philosophy entirely. Every single night they ran their sound system like they were getting paid by the decibel. I didn't just hear the music. I felt it. The bass traveled up through the floor, through my mattress, and into my spine as I lay there staring at the ceiling in the dark. Like a second heartbeat that didn't belong to me and would not stop. After 2 weeks I went down and knocked. Explained my schedule, my hours, what their music was doing to me. They were genuinely pleasant about it. Apologized, said they had no idea, promised it wouldn't happen again. I went back upstairs feeling like maybe, just maybe, it was finally over. I had barely pulled the covers up when the music came back on. Louder than before. They kept it going until 1:30 in the morning. I left for work at 3:30. That was 2 hours of sleep on a good night. I spent the entire next 12-hour shift thinking about it. By the time I got home I knew exactly what I was going to do. I took my combo amp, flipped it completely upside down so the speaker was pointing straight at the floor. Cranked the volume all the way to the right. Laid my electric guitar flat across the back so the open strings were resting against the vibrating surface. Walked out the door and headed to work. The noise complaints from my floor started coming in around 6 in the morning. The building super called me 3 times before noon. My downstairs neighbors were apparently furious. I slept like a child that afternoon. I never heard music from their unit again. Clean. Simple. The punishment fit the crime so perfectly. There was nothing left to argue about. The next story is similar, someone pushed to the edge, someone who found exactly the right response. But this one involves timing that I still think was genuinely brilliant. A friend of mine told me about his neighbor, a woman who had a habit of bringing men home at all hours of the night. Walls thin enough that the entire floor knew her schedule better than her closest friends probably did. She tried notes. She tried knocking at 2 in the morning just to make a point. Nothing worked, so she waited for the right moment. Moved her 2 floor speakers flush against the shared wall. Queued up one specific track. Sat there with her hand on the volume knob waiting. The moment she knew was coming, she felt it approaching like a countdown. She cranked a full gospel choir singing Hallelujah at absolute maximum volume directly through the wall. She told my friend she could hear her neighbor screaming in outrage from the other side. After that night, the late visits stopped. Permanently. Now those 2 stories, the amp, the choir, those feel clean. Proportional. The kind of revenge that even the person on the receiving end probably had to respect on some level. But not everyone has that kind of restraint. My wife and I lived in a townhouse development for a few years. Good neighborhood, decent people, except for one man at the end of the row who let his 2 large dogs use every lawn on the block as their personal bathroom. We talked to him. We left his dog's mess back on his doorstep. We filed a complaint. He shrugged every time like we were the unreasonable ones. One of my neighbors, a retired guy who had clearly exhausted every other option, collected the biggest pile he could find one morning, walked over in broad daylight, and smeared it across the entire front facade of the dog owner's house. Siding door frame, mailbox. Everything. The man started picking up after his dogs the very next morning. Never missed a day after that. That story ends cleanly. The next one does not. There was a quiet man on our block. Kept to himself, never caused anyone trouble. Another neighbor 2 houses down let his dog roam freely every morning, and every morning that dog made its way to the quiet man's lawn without fail. The quiet man tried everything. Cayenne pepper along the property line. Motion-activated sprinklers. A handwritten sign. A typed letter. Then a second letter. He worked through every reasonable option one at a time methodically before moving to the next. The dog owner ignored every single one of them. One morning the quiet man reached a point that I think most of us have a version of somewhere inside us, but very few of us ever actually get to. What he did next I only know because a mutual friend witnessed the whole thing from across the street and told me about it later, still looking slightly shaken. He filled a super soaker with something that was absolutely not water. He followed the dog owner home that evening to confirm the address, came back in the middle of the night, and emptied the entire thing through the mail slot in the front door, the hallway, the staircase, the kitchen at the far end of the corridor. The smell, according to my friend, was something genuinely out of a nightmare. The dog owner's home was reportedly uninhabitable for the better part of a week. He never let his dog near that lawn again. Was that justified? I honestly don't know. Hold on to that question, we are coming back to it at the very end. Because the next few people found ways to hit back that were somehow both quieter and more devastating at the same time. My mom's neighbor had been making her life miserable for over a decade. Petty complaints. Passive-aggressive notes left in the mailbox. Disputes over where the trash cans were positioned on collection day. Small, grinding, relentless behavior that never quite crossed a line but never let up either. Then the woman called the city and filed a formal complaint demanding my mom repair the fence between their yards. My mom had already been planning to repair it. She had been looking up contractors for 2 weeks. But the moment her neighbor went to a city inspector, instead of walking 20 feet across the grass to have a human conversation, something shifted in my mom that I had never seen before. She called the inspector back and asked one question. Was she legally required to have a fence at all? The inspector was quiet for a long moment. Then he explained yes, existing fences had to be maintained in good repair. But there was no ordinance in their county requiring a homeowner to have a fence in the first place. My mom thanked him, hung up, and called a demolition crew. She had the entire fence torn down to bare dirt within the week. Her neighbor came over 4 days later, furious, demanding to know when the new fence was going up. My mom looked at her and said completely calmly, "If you want a fence between our properties, you are welcome to build one yourself." 6 weeks later my mom had a beautiful new cedar fence. Her neighbor paid for every post, every board, and every hour of labor. One question. That is all it took. One question asked at exactly the right moment. And now finally we get to my grandmother. Her neighbor was a disagreeable, stubborn man who had spent years convincing himself that the fence between their 2 properties sat on her land rather than his. Every conversation about repairs ended the same way. He would fold his arms and say, "That fence is on your property, so it is your problem, not mine." My grandmother let it go because fighting him required energy she preferred to spend elsewhere. Then she fell and spent 3 weeks in the hospital. She came home to find that while she was recovering in a hospital bed, while she was hooked up to monitors and trying to get well, her neighbor had installed a brand new fence, set 5 full feet further into her yard than the original had been. And sitting in her mailbox when she got home was an invoice, with a handwritten note claiming she owed him money for repairing a structure that he now insisted had always been on his land. He argued with her for months, sent letters, showed up at her door. Eventually, he got confident enough to hire a licensed surveyor, certain the measurements would vindicate him. The surveyor found that the original fence had been sitting exactly on the correct property line all along. The new fence was 5 feet onto her side. He had taken her land while she was lying in a hospital bed. My grandmother was in her 70s by then. She was tired in a way that goes deeper than sleep can fix. And she was completely done fighting him directly. So she stopped. Instead, she went to the garden center and bought blackberry canes. She planted them along the true boundary, the line where the old fence had always stood. She watered them through that first summer, watched them take root, watched them start to spread. And every year after that she walked that edge slowly and pressed seeds into the soil on his side of the new fence. Because that ground was legally hers, had always been hers, and she knew it even if no one was going to force him to admit it. She passed away a few years ago. The blackberry vines are still there. Every spring he tears them out from his side of the fence. Every summer they come back a little thicker than the year before, pushing further into the ground he took from her. She is still out there. patient as ever, taking back what was always hers one root at a time from the other side of wherever she is now. That is what happens when someone with genuine patience decides to stop fighting and start growing. My great-grandfather played a different kind of long game, one that paid off in a single unforgettable night. He was the last person in his small town to connect to city water, which meant he still had an outhouse in the backyard well into an era when everyone else had moved on. Every Halloween without fail a group of neighborhood teenagers snuck into his yard after dark and knocked the outhouse over, leaving the pit underneath completely exposed. It was dangerous, it was a mess, and it happened like clockwork every single year. The year he turned 62, he decided he was completely done with it. The evening before Halloween he went out to the backyard and moved the outhouse forward exactly 3 feet. Just the wooden structure. The pit stayed exactly where it had always been. He covered the opening with burlap sacks and raked dead leaves over the top until the surface was completely indistinguishable from the surrounding ground. Then he went inside, made himself a cup of coffee, came back out and settled himself inside the outhouse with a lantern and a book. He sat there in the dark and waited. Sometime after 10 o'clock he heard the back gate open. Heard them coming across the yard whispering to each other, already laughing at what they were about to do. Then he heard the splash. Then the shouting, which was considerably less funny than the laughing that had come before it. He let them sit there in the dark for a few minutes, long enough for the situation to fully register, before he opened the outhouse door, looked down at them calmly, and lowered a ladder into the pit. He told them they could climb out the moment they gave him their word, their genuine, solemn, looking him in the eye word that they would never set foot on his property on Halloween again. Every single one of them promised. And then they went home and told every other teenager in the entire neighborhood exactly what had happened and exactly why. Nobody touched my great-grandfather's outhouse ever again. Not once. Some revenge takes years. Some takes a single night and a ladder. And some, like what I did for my dad, takes 6 weeks and about $3 worth of hardware store supplies. My dad stepped in once to defend a woman being screamed at in the street by our neighbor, a man who had apparently decided that the public road in front of his house belonged to him personally. My dad told him to back off and leave her alone. The neighbor and 2 of his friends jumped my dad in our own driveway. I did not react immediately. I waited 6 full weeks until I was absolutely certain they had stopped paying attention and moved on. Then one afternoon, while their work van sat in the driveway and all 3 of them were inside the house, I walked over with a small tube of superglue and put it in every single lock on that vehicle. Every door lock. Every side panel. Every lock they depended on to get to their jobs in the morning. Their entire next workday was gone before it started. Their clients were furious. It cost them real money. They never figured out who did it. My dad also had a moment that became something of a family legend, though it started as nothing more than an offhand comment about house paint. He mentioned to our neighbor one afternoon that he was thinking about repainting, maybe going with blue. The neighbor stopped walking, turned around, and told my dad in complete and total seriousness that a blue house would be an embarrassment to the entire street, that it would lower everyone's property values, and that he should not even consider it under any circumstances. I grew up in a bright blue house. My dad chose the most intensely blue shade on the entire color chart. He repainted the following spring, and never once acknowledged a single comment the neighbor made about it for the next 11 years. When my wife and I moved into our first home together, the neighbors next door had already decided before we even finished unpacking that we were the enemy. The couple who had owned the house before us had been close friends of theirs. The marriage had fallen apart, the house went on the market, and somehow the fact that we bought it made us responsible for everything that had gone wrong in their friends' lives. It wasn't rational. It didn't need to be. They blocked our driveway on mornings my wife had early shifts. They threw scrap wood over the fence into our yard. They let their dog treat our lawn like a public park. Every time I walked over to try to have a calm conversation, I got a door shut in my face before I finished my first sentence. The husband was obsessed with his lawn in a way that went beyond normal pride. He fertilized it, edged it, reseeded it every single fall. It was genuinely impressive grass, and he knew it, and he wanted everyone else to know it too. One afternoon when the clouds rolled in and the rain started, I went inside, opened the cabinet under the kitchen sink, and pulled out an entire box of beef bouillon cubes. I walked slowly along the back fence and scattered them across every inch of his lawn evenly, carefully, like I was seasoning something. The rain that night dissolved every cube straight down into the root layer. By morning their dog had destroyed every square foot of that lawn searching for the source of the smell. Months of careful obsessive work completely gone in a single morning. We moved out not long after. On my last trip to the car I emptied 2 full boxes of instant mashed potato mix across what was left of the grass. The next rainstorm turned the entire lawn into a thick pale paste. A mutual neighbor told me later he spent weeks convinced it was some kind of fungal disease. He never figured out what actually happened. I think about that sometimes and feel genuinely at peace. Now, up to this point every single person in these stories had to get creative. Had to think, plan, wait for the right moment. But the next person I want to tell you about had something none of the others had. He had access to the electrical panel. The man who lived above me treated the building like his own private nightclub. Music until 2 in the morning without fail. Stomping circuits around his apartment like he was training for a marathon. We spoke to him 3 separate times. On the 3rd attempt he handed us a pair of foam earplugs, told us to learn to relax and closed the door in our faces. What he did not know, and apparently never once thought to find out, was that the electrical panel controlling his entire unit was located inside our apartment, in our hallway closet, behind a shelf. The next time he started his late-night routine, his power went out. It came back on at 7 the next morning, right on schedule. This happened every single time he broke the quiet hours. He complained to the landlord about his electrical issues, constantly convinced something was wrong with the building's wiring. Our landlord, who had his own reasons for wanting this tenant gone and had been waiting patiently for the right moment, told us privately to stay the course and make sure no electrician ever got near that panel on his behalf. The man never once suspected us. He genuinely believed he was dealing with a faulty electrical system. He complained about it for months, filed written requests, demanded repairs that never came. A few months later he got into a physical altercation with another tenant in the hallway over a completely unrelated argument. The moment his lease expired he was gone. The power has worked perfectly ever since. My house sits right at the corner of a T intersection. The way the roads line up, drivers cutting through the neighborhood kept using my front yard as a shortcut, rolling right over the grass to avoid making a full turn. I asked them to stop. I put up a sign. I stood outside and waved people off personally on 3 separate occasions. One of them almost hit my dog. I drove to the landscaping supply yard the next morning and ordered a boulder. 150 pounds of solid granite. I had it placed right at the corner of my property line, half buried, completely immovable. That winter we got a heavy snowstorm. Everything was buried under about 8 inches of white. A guy in a pickup truck came through the intersection going his usual shortcut route, doing maybe 20 miles per hour, and hit that boulder dead center. The front end of his truck caved in completely. He sat there in the snow for a long time before he got out to look at the damage. Nobody has cut across my yard since. Not once. And finally, the last story. I saved this one for last on purpose because it is the only one in this entire video that made me laugh out loud the first time I heard it. And it is the one that, looking back, required the least effort and caused the most chaos. My brother's neighbor was a miserable man. Loud, aggressive, the kind of person who seemed to exist specifically to make the lives of everyone around him slightly worse on a daily basis. My brother had tried everything. Conversation, distance, ignoring him completely. Nothing helped. Then one afternoon my brother had an idea. This was back when local newspapers still ran classified ads for home sales, actual print listings with photos, prices, and contact numbers. My brother took a clear photograph of the front of his neighbor's house. He wrote up a listing. Set the asking price at about 75% below market value, low enough to generate serious immediate interest from every buyer in the area. And he listed his neighbor's own home phone number as the contact. Then he submitted the ad and waited. The calls started the next morning. Buyers, investors, real estate agents, people driving by and seeing the address in the paper and stopping to knock on the door. His neighbor spent the next several weeks fielding a constant stream of calls and visits from strangers who wanted to know when they could come see the place and whether the price was negotiable. My brother told me the neighbor eventually got so frustrated that he started screaming at callers, which of course only made them more confused about why the seller was being so hostile about a house he had apparently listed for sale himself. He never figured out who placed the ad. Not once. Not ever. So here we are. 13 neighbors. 13 people who pushed someone past the point of words. 13 very different responses. Some patient, some precise, some that crossed lines most of us would hesitate to cross no matter how badly we had been provoked. Which brings me back to the question I asked you to hold on to. Where is the line? Because some of these, the amp on the floor, the bouillon cubes, the fence that disappeared overnight, the fake listing that turned a man's phone into a nightmare, those feel proportional. Almost satisfying in a way that is genuinely hard to argue with. But the super soaker, the pipe over the fence, the electrical panel that got cut off every time someone wanted to listen to music. Some people are going to watch this and say every single one of them was completely justified. The neighbors started it, they finished it, that is the whole story. Others are going to say that at least 2 or 3 of these people went somewhere that no provocation, no matter how serious, could actually excuse. Which side are you on? And which specific story is the one that pushed you over your own line? Drop it in the comments. I want to see exactly where everyone lands on this, and I have a feeling this one is going to split the room right down the middle. If you are not subscribed yet, hit the button now. New stories every single week. And they only get harder to look away from.